In this video, we explore how modern economies distribute power, how ownership has shifted over time, and why many structures we associate with the distant past may be quietly reappearing in contemporary financial life. This is not a story about nostalgia or ideology, but about how systems evolve, how incentives shape behavior, and how history often returns in unfamiliar forms. You may live in a technologically advanced society, surrounded by systems that appear modern, efficient, and rational. Yet, despite this appearance, you do not own the land beneath your home. You do not control the infrastructure that delivers energy, water, or connectivity. You do not decide how much housing costs, how credit is priced, or how access to healthcare is granted. Still, participation requires constant payment. Month after month, access must be maintained. This reality invites a difficult question. At what point does a modern economy, driven by markets and finance, begin to resemble something much older in structure? When feudalism is mentioned, it is usually treated as a historical curiosity, a system associated with castles, titles, and rigid hierarchies rooted in medieval life, something inefficient, primitive, and decisively left behind by progress. The assumption is that feudalism disappeared because it no longer worked. Historically, that assumption is incomplete. Feudalism was not defined by armor or ceremony. It was defined by control over productive assets. In medieval Europe, land was the foundation of survival. It produced food, provided shelter, and determined security. Those who controlled land controlled economic life itself. Those who did not were dependent, regardless of effort or skill. This dependency shaped a system that was stable, predictable, and deeply unequal. People did not enter feudal arrangements because they were irrational or uninformed. They did so because alternatives were limited. Labor was exchanged for access. Obligations replaced mobility. Survival was conditional. Feudal societies were not chaotic. They were ordered. Everyone understood their position. Ownership was concentrated. Movement between classes was rare. Stability mattered more than choice, and that stability is precisely why feudal systems endured for centuries. What eventually disrupted feudalism was not moral awakening or economic inefficiency. It was a shift in what mattered most for survival. Industrialization reduced the centrality of land. Factories replaced fields as the primary sites of production. Cities replaced rural estates. Income could be earned without owning the underlying productive asset. For the first time, labor itself became a viable path to economic participation. This transformation created the foundation of the modern economy. Skills mattered more than inheritance. Wages replaced lifelong obligation. Employment replaced dependency on landowners. Ownership still mattered, but it was no longer the sole determinant of survival. For a period, access to income was enough. The 19th and 20th centuries produced something historically rare: a large middle class with rising wages, expanding ownership, and genuine upward mobility. Home ownership increased. Savings became meaningful. Labor gained leverage. Productivity gains translated imperfectly but materially into higher living standards. Over time, this experience shaped expectations. People began to assume that this arrangement represented a permanent equilibrium. In reality, it was an exception created by specific historical conditions. Ownership never lost its importance. It simply changed form. As industrial economies matured, physical assets were reorganized into corporate structures. Property became financialized. Infrastructure moved onto balance sheets. Capital markets expanded. Ownership reconcentrated gradually, not through force, but through incentives embedded in markets. By the late 20th century, another shift became visible. Capital grew increasingly mobile. Financial returns began to outpace wage growth. Asset appreciation became more significant than production itself. Participation in essential systems relied less on ownership and more on continuous payment. Housing evolved from shelter into a financial asset. Education became a long-term financial commitment rather than a public investment. Healthcare and infrastructure increasingly required ongoing fees. Dependency returned, though stripped of its historical language. This form of dependency does not rely on coercion. It operates through pricing. Individuals remain legally free, yet economically constrained. Movement is possible, but restarting becomes costly. Security depends less on productivity and more on access to capital. This is why comparisons to feudalism continue to surface. Not because modern economies replicate medieval life, but because the underlying mechanics are familiar. Economic power concentrates around ownership of assets that appreciate faster than labor. Those who own them accumulate leverage automatically. Those who depend on wages absorb volatility. Debt becomes central to sustaining this structure. When income growth fails to keep pace with asset inflation, credit fills the gap. These obligations are presented as opportunities, but they bind future labor to past prices. Flexibility diminishes without explicit loss of freedom. As a result, mobility feels more difficult. Not because movement is prohibited, but because the cost of movement rises. Missed payments have consequences. Access can be withdrawn. Participation remains conditional. When instability emerges, the system responds consistently. Asset values are stabilized. Liquidity flows toward ownership. Losses are distributed downward. These responses are not conspiratorial. They are the predictable outcomes of incentive design. This consistency explains much of the anxiety present in modern economic life. People are employed, yet insecure. Productive, yet exposed. Formally independent, yet structurally dependent. Effort no longer guarantees stability. Security increasingly depends on ownership that remains out of reach. This is not a moral judgment. It is an analytical observation. Feudal systems did not collapse because they were recognized as unjust. They dissolved when alternative arrangements expanded ownership and reduced dependency. When ownership spreads, reliance diminishes. When ownership narrows, dependency returns. The question, then, is not whether the system is fair. Economic systems do not optimize for fairness. They respond to incentives and seek stability. The deeper question is whether a society can remain stable when most people participate continuously but own temporarily, when risk is broadly shared but returns are concentrated, when stability is rented rather than built. History suggests that such systems can persist for long periods. It also suggests that they carry limits. Understanding this dynamic is not an argument for despair. It is an argument for clarity. Power does not disappear. It reorganizes. Economic systems evolve, carrying older logic into new forms. Feudalism did not end with the fall of castles. It ended when ownership expanded, and it reemerges when ownership contracts. Different era, different instruments, the same underlying mechanism. If this perspective helped you see the system more clearly, subscribe to Financial Labyrinth.